It's real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? lit. Real, live, lit. Right? The revolution is lit.
Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, live with the leader of the African nation, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Akile Anai, the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC. Now, we've spent the last few weeks discussing who the party is, using a thoroughly defining document titled Build and Consolidate the African People's Socialist Party. We transition into a discussion about counterinsurgency today, a war made against the Black Revolution, which included the destruction and removal of our revolutionary organizations and leaders, thus giving the party's existence greater urgency and significance. How did the party survive such an overwhelming process that resulted in the crushing defeat of our struggle? What has the party done differently since the period of the Black Revolution of the 1960s? And what contributions has the African People's Socialist Party made to advance our struggle that makes it impossible for the colonial state to ever be successful in crushing our movement again? These questions and understandings are ever more important as we recognize counterinsurgency is an unending war by the colonizer, so long as there is a colonized people fighting to be free of colonialism. Counterinsurgency looks like the FBI attacks on the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, and Chairman Omali Yeshitela. It looks like the threat of 15 years imprisonment for the Uhuru Three on bogus foreign agent charges and the end to free speech in the US. All of these measures are being taken by the colonial state to make sure that we cannot be successful in the pursuit of African freedom, agency, and the destruction of the colonial mode of production. They are being taken to make sure the masses of people on the planet are kept blind to the possibilities of a future free of colonial domination, oppression, and exploitation. Studying Chapter 3 of the book Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, written by Chairman Omali Yeshitela, not only informs us of how we got to this period, the struggles we had to wage to rebuild our movement, but what we must take on right now to complete the Black Revolution and push back the colonial state in this era of counterinsurgency. The study materials are linked in the description of this video. We will read alongside the leader of the African nation and worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, then follow with announcements before opening it up for questions and answers with our live audience. And as always, we call on you to spread the word and build the Omali Taught Me show by sharing this study far and wide, liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and commenting in the chat. We are fully aware of the war, the counterinsurgency war, being made on our right, not only to say what's in our interest, but for the people to have access to what we say as well. So thank you for taking this moment right now, liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing. Make sure you are letting people know that this study is happening right now and tag them in the chat so that they have the ability to participate as well. So now let's get started and welcome our leadership, Chairman Amalia Shatella. Uhuru, Chairman.
Oh, very much, Comrade Director Akile, and welcome to everyone who's participating in this study. Again, I'd like to send a special shout out to Africans who are not in the United States, and especially those who are in locations that have suffered as a part of the process of building the colonial empire that has enriched the white world at our expense. And therefore, it means they've sucked out various kinds of resources that would allow for infrastructure to be developed there. And many of you, I know, engaged in group settings in order to participate in this discussion, because sometimes electricity and other times various other necessary components of infrastructure do not exist to give you easy access to computers and to internet and things like that. So, and a special shout out to my dear sister-in-law, Afua Waller, who is located in Ghana. So this is like an important study. And sometimes when we come to these discussions, I'm thinking, sitting here before you now, facing a 15-year sentence of imprisonment because I taught. And I remember, of course, how many African people have been killed because they taught. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Fred Hampton, other people like that were killed because they taught, not because they committed some kind of criminal offense. They were not bank robbers. They were not kidnappers. They were not drug pushers. In fact, they were opposed to bank robbery, kidnapping, and drug pushing and things like that. But they were killed. And I'm reminded every time I sit here how ridiculous it is that we have to have this discussion, recognizing that there are foreigners and aliens who've kidnapped us and put us in this place, and who are listening to every word we say, who have put spies and sellouts and people who betray their mothers and fathers and their neighbors to crush a movement for our freedom. And how disgusting it is, how offensive it is to our own humanity as a people to live under this permanent domination. I saw something, I was looking at something today, NPR, I think it's National Public Radio, where they were talking about the tremendous number of murders, as they characterize homicides in St. Louis, where I'm currently located. And over the last decade, they say something like 2,000 African people have been killed here in St. Louis due to horizontal violence. It's a violent city, they say. And more than a half of those 2,000, so more than 1,000 of those murders, they say, have gone unsolved. They don't know who did it or anything like that. Well, colonialism did it, and they can write things like that, and they can report. And this is national public radio, and in many instances, in many ways, some people consider that to be like an enlightened form of information and what have you. But how can they write about this and not say that we are talking about an African population living under foreign domination, whose ability to feed, clothe, and house themselves, whose ability to secure a future for their children is not only compromised, but actually under assault in every aspect of their lives, where schools are not only closed on a regular basis, but when they're open, they are open for the purpose of misinforming, miseducating the masses of African people. How can they report on the number of so-called homicides in this community without talking about how the African population lives in what they would characterize as a food desert, when food is everywhere and in sight, in view of the African community that is in the possession of those who control our ability to eat. And of course, when you live in a situation that's under absolute control, absolute domination by oppressors, and within a system where the majority of certainly a great and tremendous number of the population who cannot be considered under normal circumstances the ruling class support what is happening to us and have filled often with disdain and hatred of us because we do not have freedom to express ourselves. They don't know a damn thing about us because we lie to them when we talk about ourselves to them. And the oppressor ruling class lies all the time about who we are and who they are in this relationship. So I'm just saying this as a prelude to going into this discussion, that it is absolutely ridiculous to be sitting before you, engaged in a discussion about how we fought and defended ourselves against this counterinsurgency, against this attempt to crush a movement that just wanted happiness, that just wanted the return of our stolen resources, and to be sitting here on a land of indigenous people stolen from them, that we have been forced to occupy, taken from our homelands and removed from our traditions and from our relationships and things like that. And so much of what they characterize as a crime respond not just to that kind of things like what we say, but even when you look at especially the crimes against African women and families, as they're concentrated then, and the slander. Women, African women who don't take care of their children, African men who don't take care of their families and what have you, stuck into systemic ridicule, oppression, dependency through this relationship, as though there's something natural and normal about it. In fact, they do say there's something natural and normal. Starvation and ignorance and violence is normal for Africans and the oppressed. In fact, in many instances, most instances, they proclaim their presence in our midst as there to protect us from ourselves. They tell us stories about how the Aztecs, who were rescued in many ways by the Spanish because they were involved in serious kinds of self-murder, where we would kill, the Aztecs would kill each other as part of religious ceremonies and things like that. And they have to step in to kill people. It's like that old thing that they used to say during the Vietnam, that they had to destroy villages in order to save them. This was actually a comment that was made during the time when the U.S. was involved in murdering people in Vietnam who just wanted to be free. And the vast majority of the people on this earth, they just want to be free, to have freedom of expression, freedom to live, freedom to be joyful, freedom to know that their children have a future, freedom to not have to be toadies for foreigners who don't know us and whose ability to appreciate us is terribly distorted and affected by the fact that they need us on our knees and our bellies and in graves in order to be successful in their own living process. So I just wanted to say that, and then we're going to go and look at chapter 3, how the party survived the counterinsurgency. We're having this discussion because we do suffer from the kind of oppression and exploitation that I opened this discussion referencing. And in order to get ourselves out of this situation, it's absolutely necessary to have, first of all, a recognition that we are in it. And our oppressors do everything to confuse us around this question. They put forth the notions that somehow our situation is due to the fact that those who oppress us don't like us, or because they are not nice, something to that effect. And so we look for solutions to the problem of people not liking us and people not being nice. And then we see leaders people who have been created and put before us as leaders who engaged in organizing and mobilizing African people in order to be liked and to be accepted by the oppressor. So it's fundamental, the fundamental thing that distinguishes us in this moment in history is recognizing that we are an oppressed nation of people, that we brought into a relationship through gunpoint, through whips and chains, and dogs and other and cages and things like this, that this is not a normal relationship. They wouldn't have to have a police on every corner in our communities if it were normal. They wouldn't have prisons throughout this country and other places in the world where African people are located that are filled with disproportionate number of Africans. And depending upon the complexion of the territory, the country, that we live in, Africans and other people who are colonized wouldn't be in these prisons. So we do have a political party because we have to have an organization that can lead, that can organize us, that can give clarity to us, and that recognizes that even that the whole African people live under colonial domination, that all of us are brought into this relationship through guns and whips and chains and things like that on the one hand, but there's a sector of the population we recognize that can be satisfied with just having a good relationship, just being able to survive in a good way within this system of oppression, exploitation for the vast majority of us. And so while we talk about fighting for the liberation of the whole nation, we recognize that the majority of us cannot be satisfied with the crumbs that are often bestowed upon a sector of the population that is raised up by the white colonial oppressors as our leaders, who we can read about in the newspapers, who we can see on television, who can stand behind old dying white men who are supposed to be leaders of the so-called free world, like bobbleheads and things like that. That's the world that they would have us perceive to be normal. Barack Hussein Obama, whose middle name rhymes with what we might say Barack is. He's not angry with anybody. He's real cool. He doesn't get upset. He is self-characterized, self-defined mongrel, the kind of thing that white nationalist people who are characterized as racist have referred to us as a normal thing. He is the guy who recognizes that the problem happening in our communities and our families, the irresponsibility of Black fathers who don't take care of children. Of course, he doesn't say how it's really hard to do that when you're locked up in prisons, when you're running from the police on a regular basis, when you can't get jobs in your community due to this kind of setup that we have. So we have to have a party that is responsible for recognizing and that the whole nation has to be freed, has to be liberated. We have to take back, to put it relatively scientifically, we have to liberate the forces of production. We have to take back our land. We have to free the people who have knowledge and who would work that land, et cetera. And so we have a party that talks about what sector of the population cannot be satisfied with this, that upon who have to be a sector of the population that has to be organized to lead this struggle, that would even drag screaming and pleading and belly crawling sectors of the African petty bourgeoisie along with this into this process of freedom for the whole nation, not recognizing also that it's not a trustworthy sector of the population, generally speaking, as long as that class exists. But we destroy the basis for the African petty bourgeoisie through destroying the colonial base upon which the whole social system rests, and only the African working class can do that. So we are now on page 3 of a political report that was made to the African People's Socialist Party Congress, and I shall proceed now, and please read with me if you like. So This is a political report, as I mentioned, that was made to our Congress. It was a political report that was spoken at our Congress. And what happens at the Congress is that the political report is made, and the membership of the African People's Socialist Party has an opportunity, and this is a process that's gone on for at least 3 months in our organization, of looking at and examining this political report and having an opportunity to critique, to criticize this political report. And at the actual Congress itself, the political report is presented and it is voted up or down by the membership of the African People's Socialist Party. So it has my name on it as the author of the political report, but it's a political report of the whole Congress, of the whole party. And so it's something that was voted on, adopted, accepted by the entire organization. I think it's important to say that too, because the people who hate us, black and white, petty bourgeois, neo-colonial sellouts, and the ruling class sometimes like to refer to us as a cult. Because generally speaking, we are tightly knit. When we are at our best, we are a tightly knit, united force, believing in the same thing, and united in practice, and united in with our ideas, et cetera. So they like to say that we're a cult, but this is a strange cult in the sense that this is a democratic cult. This is a process that we go through where the membership has an opportunity to vote on the direction of the organization, to say yay, yay, nay, nay, and even elect the people who are going to head this cult, and if there's a cult at all, I would call it a Democratic Party or Republican Party or something to that effect. So comrades, since its inception in 1972, our party has been the only force that through theory and practice exposed the historical basis for both for the rise of the Black Power movement of the 1960s and its demise. We give the historical basis. This is true. You won't find this written anyplace else that examines the historical material basis for the rise of the Black Power movement. You hear some people are angry and disappointed and all kind of nonsense like that, but we try to bring science into this discussion. This is the thing that will free us. We need science, and we don't need more root doctors, and even though root doctors might be good when it comes to curing people of disease and things like that, but we need science to do this. We need to have science. Science is the thing that will clear the swamps of where we live in different places, help to defeat the mosquito who drags malaria all around it, who can make sure that there is an infrastructure where we're living and can come up with a strategy for defeating our enemies and building a new world for ourselves and for other people around the world. We are the singular voice that waged tireless political struggle and fierce on-the-ground campaigns, showing that the demise of our courageous movement in the 60s was brought about by a violent and devastating U.S. government counteroffensive known in military terms as counterinsurgency. The will to struggle and the heady confidence of the African working class, feeling the power of its own leadership, did not go out of style or lose favor among the masses, as fabricated in the US government's narrative of our defeat. By the mid to late 70s, almost all those so-called revolutionary African leaders and organizations inside the United States and around the world that had actually survived the US government's murderous assault were now compliant with imperialism's myths about what happened to us and our historical liberation struggle. So this is by the mid to late 70s, most of these forces that survived the period of murder, et cetera, had become supplicants, were compliant with the myths and about what happened to us and our historic liberation struggle. Contrary to the ruling class lies, the African working class did not suddenly develop a preference for heroin and crack cocaine, poverty, homelessness, police murder, and years in prison over self-determination and political power. We did not abandon our children or willingly turn them over to their kidnappers in the U.S. foster care and prison systems. We did not gladly give up our power and leadership to the African petty bourgeoisie, the neo-colonial class. As we have said many times, the African working class inside this country, which had been for centuries the revolutionary moral compass for oppressed peoples around the world, was now criminal, hated, and detested in the United States government's carefully crafted counterinsurgent plan. After more than a decade of concerted struggle, hard-fought-for rights were rapidly taken away, and the conditions of the African working class were soon worse than they had been before we rose up. Counterinsurgency is what the U.S. and imperialist powers of parasitic capitalism do to colonized peoples when we fight for our freedom and independence through revolution. The heroic peoples of Vietnam, Chile, and Nicaragua, and African people in Congo, Kenya, and South Africa were among many others who bore the brunt of imperialist counterinsurgency. Is the king down here? Okay. It's a bit warm. Am I the only one experiencing this? I got the lights on me. Okay, that's why there's so much, that's why there's heat. A counterinsurgency is a war without terms. When white people fight each other, they have the Geneva Convention defined as rules that apply in times of armed conflict and seek to protect people who are not or no longer taking part in hostilities. These include the sick and wounded of armed forces on the field, wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea, prisoners of war, and civilians. When they fight us, however, the Geneva Convention does not apply, and they do anything they want, including to civilians, the wounded, the sick, and prisoners of war. Sometimes, and most times, they don't even characterize those who have fallen to them as prisoners of war. They simply criminalize the behavior of African people who rise up and as part of a process to liberate ourselves. Almost 30 years ago, we summed up in my 1991 book, Black Power Since the 60s, the struggle against opportunism within the US front of the Black liberation movement. And we're quoting now from that book. While ever present since our forced sojourn within this US North American hell, this counterinsurgency has achieved a different character since its effective use during the Black Revolution of the 60s to destroy a movement for happiness and repossession of our stolen resources. Essentially, this counterinsurgency changed character from one which, while it attacked the whole African people, had its primary emphasis on the destruction of the specific individuals and organizations, to one which has as its primary target the entire African people, especially the revolutionary African working class. There are various components to the counterinsurgency. It employs each branch of the government and a host of state-connected institutions, as well as the bourgeois media and other instruments of mass culture controlled by the US colonial state and ruling class. Of particular significance to this discussion is the use of drugs and neo-colonialism as components of the counterinsurgency. The impact of drugs on the African community is well known, if not even exaggerated. For several years, the white ruling class media, excuse me, have quite selectively overwhelmed our consciousness with images of drugged out African mothers, African children who were born addicted, African illnesses and wretchedness which are due to drug use. And of course, the violent African youths who are victims of and responsible for the torrent of violence and homicide that characterizes so much of our existence. That's what we were talking about in terms of that NPR report on Oakland that I was looking at this morning, talking about the number of people over the last decade who have been killed, homicides, 2,000 people. And that's a hell of a lot of people. And but they would make that responsibility ours, and they would liquidate the whole colonial question, colonial conditions that we live in and suffer from. People who accept that definition find themselves fighting against each other, fighting against young people. The young people are the enemy. Every day I go to the gym, I encounter some strong old African man who's not going to let these young people run over him. And he's talking about being run over by, and I'm not scared of them. Of course not. But we know who you are scared of. And that's what you don't mess with, so it's easier to target the young African people than it is a monstrous government and system that's oppressing and killing us and driving young people, making it impossible young African people to see alternatives to the system they're living in. That's why they attack us, because we talk about there's an alternative to this life. And it ain't the young people. And it's not like one of the persons who was in city government here that wanted to send the National Guards into the African community. And Bobby Rush, who's a congressman out of Illinois, who at one time been the Minister of Defense of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, Illinois, has, since he's become a congressperson, at one time called on bringing the National Guards into the housing project, Sabrina Green in Chicago. And at the point where you begin to accept this notion that somehow we are our own enemy, then anything goes in killing each other. You join the oppressor who's already killing us 1,000 different ways, and you become a part of that army killing African people who you've determined to be the enemy. And of course, there are enemies among us, but usually those enemies are bobbleheads, who stand behind old white men shaking their head for everything, every crime that they intend to commit against Black people. And African young people who are victimized, sometimes think they're the criminals too. They've accepted the definition that has been imposed on us about what is crime and what is not crime. So oppressing and killing a whole population is not a crime. It is a $15 bag. It is the kinds of things that we engage in as a consequence of living on a criminal kind of system. Indeed, the media have consciously worked to criminalize the African community and people, mostly through manipulation of the drug issue. There's some kind of rebooted of the Good Times. Is that the name of the thing? Good Times, that they're doing in a cartoon fashion. And there are protests that are happening around that at Netflix. Netflix is doing this. And I'm trying to remember that Steph Curry, I think, is one of the producers of this thing. And it shows African, babies, and I mean this literal sense of the word, African baby drug pushers who got guns and stuff like that. I mean, it's just a whole thing that they continue to perpetuate. And even we will find some humor here and talk about it and end up liking it. Many of us will, if we, can't do something to provide the kind of political education to our people. But what this does is contribute to the atmosphere, prevailing atmosphere, criminalizing the entire community. So anything you do to Black people from babies on up is okay. It's okay if you live in a city like Oakland, like here in St. Louis, North St. Louis, where something like enough Black babies die in the first year of life to fill 15 kindergarten classes. It's all right, because if they're not now, they're going to be drug dealers and crackheads and gun-wielding people. That's the kind of climate. That's the thing that they create, and it's a part of Netflix. Netflix is promoting that. We should unsubscribe. Let's unsubscribe to Netflix. I mean, just for this kind of garbage they impose. Of course, that means we're going to be unsubscribing to a lot of stuff. So the selective uses of the media has defined the African in the popular consciousness. This includes too much of the African consciousness as well, as a criminal entity suffering from self-inflicted ills that beset us, or as a community on the road to self-destruction. That's something in quotes, that because there was a great leader of the African community who defined our problems in that fashion, that we had serious political struggles with at one point. It is no longer the vicious colonial repression as exemplified by the fact that more than a quarter of our male youth are tied to the prison system, or that the infant mortality rate within our colonized community is at least twice that for white people, or the vicious police and white citizen violence constantly directed at African people that defines our existence. It is no longer the economic exploitation that denies us work within the legal capitalist economy, while at the same time charging us more for shoddier goods, from housing and transportation to food and healthcare, that defines our reality. It is no longer the African oppressed by colonial white power who we are aware of, but the thankless, criminally violent, drug-addicted African who has tried the patience of civilized white society for the last time. And indeed, drugs, violence, and crime do haunt our community, but they do so as part of a vicious U.S. government-imposed counterinsurgency that is designed to crush any attempts by our desperate people to realize national liberation. So only our party has provided a historical and class analysis of the development of the Black Revolution of the 60s that must be understood by militants and activists attempting to interpret the state of our struggle today. One critical point is the profound correlation between the historical events occurring in Africa and other places throughout the colonial world and the freedom movement of Africans inside the United States. As I wrote in 1997 in the pamphlet, Why I Became a Revolutionary, quote, "I'm fortunate to have been born in an era of great transformation in the world. It was a time when the basic social contradictions of this country became obvious for all to see, especially those contradictions which revolve around the so-called race question. The 1940s was also the era in which great movements against direct white rule or colonialism were occurring worldwide. In 1947, India achieved formal independence from England, and the Great Chinese Revolution occurred in 1949. Other revolutionary anti-colonial movements were sweeping Africa, Asia, and Latin America," unquote. It was this period that most determined how we understand the nature and character of our struggle today. The image and bold initiatives of Kwame Nkrumah, first president of independent Ghana, and the implacable stance of Patrice Lumumba are etched in the consciousness of all who look back at that era of universal struggle of African people. We were made confident of our road to liberation by the incorruptible visage of Malcolm X and the massive mobilizations for democratic rights organized by Dr. Martin Luther King. The scenes of courageous young Africans from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Hunter of Militant Organizations, and the Black Panther Party, to name just a few examples of the high resistance of the time, leave many Africans at a loss. Why the current lack of direction for the mass movement today? Why the absence of universal opposition to our colonial domination as a people? Only the African People's Socialist Party has answered these questions. The answers lay in the counterinsurgency. Bourgeois thinkers in this country have come up with a shallow explanation for the rise of anti-colonial liberation struggles during or following both the first and second imperialist wars to redivide the world. The massive phenomenon known as the Marcus Garvey movement followed on the heels of the First Imperialist World War, while the historic civil rights movement rose up in the years following the Second Imperialist War. They tell us that African soldiers and other colonial subjects who participated in those wars in defense of our colonial oppressors were inspired by our first glimpse of freedom when we visited other lands as soldiers for the empire. There may be some truth to the fact that many of the colonized were able to leave our neighborhoods and villages and experience a larger world for the first time since white power took over our lives. Nevertheless, An understanding of the explosive and generalized growth of the struggle for national liberation in the US and around the world must be sought beyond the self-laudatory explanations of the international colonial bourgeoisie. Historically, the colonial rulers have always employed their subjects to fight their predatory wars, whether between themselves or against other colonial subjects. The British used Africans from other African colonies in their attacks against the courageous Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, or Mau Mau. The Mau Mau successfully stood up to the British Empire for many years before the brutal, terroristic British counterinsurgency campaign was able to crush the heroic struggle in the 1960s. The French deployed troops from their various colonies in their vain efforts to defeat the magnificent life and freedom-affirming Vietnamese Revolution, liberating Vietnam from French colonialism. 71% of French troops fighting France's colonial wars against the Vietnamese were actually subjects from Algeria, Senegal, Ivory Coast, and other French colonies. When the US entered the war on the side of French imperialism in an attempt to maintain the colonial slavery of the Vietnamese people, it is said that 50 to 65% of the troops on the front lines were domestically colonized Africans. Not to mention Mexicans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans, other forces also colonized inside the United States. It is true that the participation of Africans and other colonial subjects in these imperialist wars did introduce thousands of us to contemporary military training and the invaluable experience of fighting under enemy fire without panic. This is something that those people who are trained in warfare, they have the advantage of being engaged in armed confrontation without panic, or at least a panic that would just force them to drop their guns and run and things like that. That's what training does. And so this thrusting of colonized people into these situations offered training to African people to be engaged in this kind of armed conflict without panic. And this aided the anti-colonial armed struggle being waged in our own interest against our colonial oppressors. Participation in the US wars also served to destroy the colonial myth of the courage and indestructibility of the white man, and even provided legal opportunities for actually killing him. White men could die at the hands of a lowly nigger. They could scream in pain, just like an African being burned to death by a white lynch mob in the US. This was instructive. The greatest value of the Second Imperialist World War for the struggle against colonialism, however, is the fact that the imperialist bandits who were in fierce struggle against each other to redivide the world meaning us and our lands, were unable to give our oppression the usual ruthless attention. The war had left many of the colonial powers exhausted and preoccupied. In some cases, the imperialists actually required the colonized to take on some of the colonial responsibilities previously in the sole control of the colonizer. All of this provided us political space that we, the colonized, everywhere used to organize against our oppressors. Inside the United States, thousands of African people risked their lives and limbs fighting in the first imperialist war for the interests and freedom of white people, only to be targeted upon return to the US with lynchings, Jim Crow, unspeakable violence, and assault by those same white people after the war. African and colonized people worldwide faced a similar situation. As the fever for independence swept the colonial world, hungry for our own freedom and independence, following the war, more than 11 million African people here and around the world flocked to the African national liberation struggle movement led by Marcus Garvey. So British colonial subjects inside England created real class struggle. With the end of the Second Imperialist War, the world economy changed hands from the British, who up to that time controlled 25% of the world's population and territory, to those of the United States. The myth of British tea-sipping white civility as the imperialist in chief was destroyed by the German bombing of London and other cities in England, and by rising struggles for national liberation inside British colonies. Out of desperation following the war, The British made a call to their colonial subjects from throughout the world to come home to rebuild England, thereby growing a domestic or internal colony similar to that in the United States. And that was really something. I mean, so you had British colonialism, British colonizing peoples all over the world. I mean, 25% of the world's population at the time was living under British colonial domination. 25% of the territory on the earth was controlled by England. England put forth itself as this tea-sipping civil country, and even now, the British, they don't show excitement, and they're cool British, etc. Civility is something that prevailed in the popular imagination. And then when the Germans, and here you have the colonizers fighting among themselves. Germany wins this war, crushes England. Well, it certainly crushes England in terms of the war. And then to rebuild itself after the war, England puts out this call to all these colonized people that's killing all over the world. I mean, they kill at least 50 million people in India, and they're killing all this, and they say, come home, because this is the mother country. England is the mother country. It's the mother country. And so to come to England to rebuild England, and we did. And after the Civil War in this country, when Europeans fighting each other over the loot, etc., it was Black people who rebuilt the economy. Sometimes it's convict leasing and stuff like that. We rebuilt it for them. We didn't get nothing. And the people in India and the people in other places didn't get nothing from this. It's just the colonizer who gets this, because everything rests upon the foundation of our colonial exploitation. So soon thousands of colonial workers were recruited to relocate to England to be exploited in the process of reconstructing the former colonial power that now lay in ruins. This influx of Africans and South Asians into the imperialist center initiated real class struggle that ruptured the facade of class peace. Previously, the unity of British workers with their ruling class made it unnecessary to arm the English police. They used to brag about this. The Bobbies carry no guns, et cetera, et cetera. The internal class struggle in England had been smothered by the abundance of colonial booty that filled markets, dinner tables, urban department stores, and provided holidays and home ownership for workers and the bourgeoisie alike. Class struggle was also muted by the transfer of excess white population to the resource-generating far reaches of the empire: Southern Africa, Kenya, India, Australia, Canada. I mean, this is one way to deal with class struggle, isn't it? I mean, Fidel did that during the time where these bandits and thugs who supported U.S. imperialism and criminals, he emptied all the prisons, jails, and put them on boats and sent them to the United States that they seemed to love so much. Of course, the U.S. didn't love getting those criminals and what have it, caused serious disruption. But the point is, they dealt with class. One of the class contradictions for Europe was shipping these Europeans to the colonies. And so that took off pressure there. So white people who never owned homes in their lives, who never had resources in their life, now they got homes on Indian land, on African land and territory, and all they got to do, it's a simple thing, is just help kill the Indians, help control the Africans, and kill the Africans, and they have it made. What a way to advance and contain, make your life worthwhile. And so this is what makes it easier to hate Palestinians, because you're on their land and they're always trying to get it back, and they're always willing to do something to you for being on their land and denying their children a future. This is why it was so easy. I read something, I've mentioned this before, about poor Jews in 1939 who escaped from horrible oppression in Germany, and they went to escape oppression in Germany to Kenya. And so they're in Kenya now celebrating being free from the oppression of Germans. But guess what? Kenya was colonized. This is where the Mau Mau came from in Kenya to fight against British colonialism. This is the kind of relationship that we're talking about that exists all over the world. This is a colonial mode of production. Every damn thing that's produced on earth, it happens within the context of this mode of production. So today, the British do not boast so loudly of a pacifist police department. Increasingly, the armed British police force inside England is no different from the arm of the state called the Army when it is deployed in Kenya, Nigeria, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, South Africa, India, and Ireland. This is what the police are called in these places. This is the Army, and they were not nonviolent. They were not people who didn't carry guns. They carried guns, mustard gas, all kinds of weaponry when they were in Ireland, when they were in various parts of Africa and India. So the United Kingdom is a lot less united today as a consequence of the importation of labor and class struggle from the British colonies. Ain't that something? So while many colonies were able to win nominal independence through people's struggles in the years following the Second Imperialist War, imperialist powers retained economic and political domination over African people. The imperialist strategy of neocolonialism, or white power in blackface, carried out by the African and colonized petty bourgeoisie, proved to be an essential tool of counterinsurgency. So we're looking now at class forces at work in the rise of the civil rights movement. We hear a lot of myths about the Second World War to redivide the world, the Second War, the Second Imperialist World War. And the U.S. writes the narrative, and it's a real heroic narrative for the United States. Anyway, we say class forces at work in the rise of the civil rights movement. The United States did not suffer the consequences of war being fought within its domestic borders and became the center of the capitalist world economy. See, England, France, Belgium, all these colonial countries, they suffered the consequences of this war among each other for control of the world, for redividing the loot of the world. But the war was not fought inside the United States. So all of these countries had to rely on the United States for reconstruction. The United States became the chief hegemon of the whole global empire, certainly a colonial empire. And so it says that, so we write here that the U.S. became the center of the capitalist world economy. This is reflected in what is known as the Bretton Woods Conference, the 1944 United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which established the World Bank, an international monetary fund that relocated the center of the world capitalist financial center to the United States. Listen, I know, brothers and sisters and comrades, that in some ways this is a rather unusual discussion in the sense that we're talking to the African workers, African working class, we're talking to working class in general, who we don't have this kind of discussions. I mean, it's far-fetched. I was talking to a dear comrade on yesterday at what's it called, a vegan market thing. And we were talking about how boring history was and when we were growing up, because it didn't teach us nothing. So some dates, and it didn't connect anything in the world. So and so our class, the working people, don't get meaningful political education. You don't know a damn thing about the world, and the petty bourgeoisie, African petty bourgeoisie, tell us that the African working class, that's too heavy, can't understand it. It's a real despicable kind of position that they have around ordinary African people. And, the fact is that I know that if I can understand it, anybody can understand it. So ain't nothing special about me. So if I get it, they get it. And the point is, it's the African petty bourgeoisie that wants to hog all the information, and they do this in order to protect the social system that we have to fight against. So now, just talking about this whole system of how the United States was defined and how it promoted itself as this great noble power during the Second Imperialist World War, when the fact is that it wasn't fought in the United States, and the United States entered the war really late. It was the Russians. It was the Russians who crushed the Nazis, and the Russians who lost at least 27 million people in the fight against the Nazis. It was the Russians that crushed them, etc. But the United States doesn't say that. It never says that. It puts itself forward as this great power. And so this statement I just made about the Russians, which can be checked out, anybody who wants to investigate it can check it out. But there's further evidence as far as the United States is concerned, the fact that I work for Russia, because I'm saying this. But the truth of the matter is that it was Russia. It was the Russians who bled, who fought, who destroyed the Nazis, who crushed the Hitler's military force, Hitler's armies and what have you, and at the horrible expense to Russia. Anyway, so the European imperialist powers were now forced to share with the United States their previously dominated markets and resources from their colonial bounty. So now Europe, since the emergence of the United States, unscathed by the war, now created this World Bank and all this other kind of stuff coming out of the war. And so the European powers, beaten up, broken down, were now forced to share with the United States their previously dominated markets and resources from their colonial bounty. You see these movies about the mafia, and they get together and make an agreement on who's going to get this and who's going to get that. We know that you have all the judges in your pocket, right? So, get the judge. This is how this whole thing comes down. It comes down now. And so they got to make a deal. The European powers now have to submit to the leadership of the United States as the thug in charge. And so raw materials from the colonies that were open up to U.S. exploitation, you must let us come and sell our drugs on your side of town. The raw materials that from the colonies that were controlled by England, France, etc., now open up to for exploitation by the United States. The United States can come in and get some of it, get a lot of it because of the outcome of that war. Raw materials from the colonies that were opened up to U.S. exploitation began to generate a critical need for U.S. workers to transform these raw materials into finished products. So you got all these raw materials, what you gonna do with them? That becomes the question. And so workers from Eastern Europe, having become a part of the Soviet bloc, as it was characterized after the war, were no longer available to the United States as in the past. In the past, what happened was when there was a labor shortage, they would go to Eastern Europe, Hungary, and other places like that, and they would bring workers in. That's where the concept of hunky comes from. And I hate to disappoint Africans who thought we thought about it. It was the white people who was calling Hungarians hunkies, and they were taking their jobs and all this other stuff being brought into the United States, right? And but now they don't have access to these workers from Eastern Europe because the Soviet Union now has won this part of the war, and what's in Eastern Europe now has become a part of the Soviet bloc. That is to say, the bloc that's controlled by Russia. So they can't get no hunkies. Even though we was calling them hunkies, the hunkies were no longer accessible. So the bourgeois solution for the U.S. worker shortage was located in the southern states among the domestically colonized African working class. But the problem was that the relations of production in the South required Africans to be tied to the intense, back-breaking toil associated with the labor-intensive capitalism in jobs such as sharecropping, mining, and agricultural work, clearing swamps, and all this other nasty stuff. I mean, horrible, horrible stuff. And some of it was done early on by convict leasings and stuff like that, where it was Black people good in the swamps and with the snakes in it and clear them out and do all this other kind of stuff. That was the way they did it. So the Southern-based labor-intensive colonial capitalist system was opposed to any kind of change that might challenge its profit and domination and the existing relations of production that protected it. These relations of production were justified by the ideology of white nationalism, which had used terrorist violence for its perpetuation since the earliest days of our enslavement on southern plantations. It was for these reasons that African laborers were denied the right to minimum education that would be necessary for workers in the capital-intensive production in northern factories. This is why the liberal U.S. bourgeoisie supported the nonviolent efforts to legalize education and basic civil rights for the oppressed African workers in the South, because they needed the African workers now. They needed African workers to be free from this situation that they were locked into the South, because where capital of development, capitalist production was labor intensive. If they could have, they would have got a bunch of monkeys to do the work. They did not need anybody with any kind of education, anybody who could see beyond the limitation that they had imposed them in those circumstances. So that's why you couldn't get any education. You couldn't do anything. Next thing you know, you'll be wanting to be the boss. Next thing you know, you'll be thinking that you're equal to white, or that you're human, or something to that effect. So the apartheid regime in South Africa was influenced and built on the same relations of production that existed within the United States, where Africans were totally disenfranchised and defined as subhuman. There was such a thing as nigger work that placed restrictions on where Africans could work and what we were permitted to do within those workspaces. In many ways that exists today, they just don't call it that anymore. All you got to do is go to an airport and see who the workers in the airport, see who's on security, see who's behind the counter selling this or that, see in the banks and see who are the people who are acting in these service kind of jobs. Those are the African, those are colonized people who want that. And once they wake up, they're in trouble. Once we wake them up, they're in trouble. Even the guy who they send to my house as a condition for my not being locked up in prison right now is an African man. You understand? And this is the kind of situation that we live with, and it makes them extraordinarily and vulnerable. That's always been true of colonialism. Empire always has had, even going back to Rome, had to rely on services from those that they oppressed, et cetera. And that has proved to be one of the greatest contradictions that they contend with that brought the whole empire down. So separate toilets, drinking fountains, and neighborhoods were used to define Africans as less human than the North Americans or whites, who set the standard for human identity. The colonial states, which included the white population in the South, also initiated deadly prohibitions on all social interactions, especially sexual, between the colonizer and colonized, essentially between African men and North American women. These deadly prohibitions involve massive government sanctions, lynchings, human burnings, torture, white mob attacks, destroying whole African towns, rape and general degradation of African people, for which as of 1950s, no white perpetrator has ever been prosecuted. A crude, but generally accepted ideologically backward definition of African humanity was a logical expression of the economic base of a slavery-generated social system. It is a definition that prevails up to this day, not only for Africans within the US, but for Africans in general, all of whom were brought into a relationship with Europe through the global colonial slavery-related economy. Nor is this backwards ideological assumption restricted to what are generally regarded as reactionary, Klan, Boers, or fascist types of European whites. We're talking here about the ideological foundation of capitalism that permeates all of Europe, other capitalist-dominated societies, and essentially the entire world. Happy Christian families, liberals, and cookie-baking grandmothers all embrace this ideology and carried out this violence. All of them. Yeah. I grew up, they used to have these cartoons with the really kindly grandmothers, white cartoons, because white people were subjects always, history. Real kindly grandmother, and with the little neat bun, I don't know what you call that thing, that in the back of the head. Somebody tell me what that is. It's a little bun. What is it?
But
Oh, it's a bun. Okay. And it's just a kindly, it just warms your heart every time you see this little kindly white woman. You understand? But all she ever had to say was that he looked at me or he did such and such a thing. And that was it. That was it. She might protect Tweety Bird from the putty cat. But she was at you in a minute. She could lynch you. She could kill and did over and over again. So African workers attempting to leave the U.S. South for the capital-intensive production of the North often had to do so under extremely dangerous circumstances. In many instances, Africans risked their lives to acquire the education necessary for laborers in capital-intensive production. These contradictions led to the alliance between members of the liberal sector of the colonial bourgeoisie as represented by U.S. Senator and Vice President Hubert Horatio Humphrey and former U.S. Presidents John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson and the liberal colonized African petty bourgeoisie. Both needed change and access to African workers, but for entirely different reasons. Both needed the revolution from above that would not overturn the entire colonial capitalist system. The African working class, perennial victims of this terror and arbitrary, extra-legal, and often very subjective, personalized violence, desperately needed relief from this situation. We wanted to be able to see a future where our children would not be locked into indeterminate, relentless brutality with poverty and backbreaking nigger work. Violence is really something. You see that with, and some of the police guys, police persons. It's extraordinarily subjective kind of violence. It's not just, tightening handcuffs a little too much or something like that. It's almost irrational. One would seem the kind of violence that they perpetrate. How they kill, how they killed George Floyd. And you remember before George Floyd, that brother they killed in New York for selling a cigarette and how they crushed his head into the cement and what have you. It's a real vicious, and it permeates the whole society here. The disregard, the hatred, the fact that African people are so despised, it's integral to a social system that has to explain and justify its existence through exploiting Africans and other peoples around the world. So it's a subjective kind of stuff that we would see. We ain't never met this guy. We don't know his mama. We don't know nothing about him, but this is the worst kind of violence. They cut off your penis and stick it in your mouth before they kill you. They take women, and the indigenous women as well. These horrid kinds of things that they did. So anyway, the colonized liberal African petty bourgeoisie also needed democratic changes for its own protection. I'm mentioning this in part because, you got these great white liberals, like Lyndon Baines Johnson from Texas. He was the president, and he was the one who was the great protector, the great liberal. He's promoted even today. And I just remember Malcolm X's characterization of Johnson versus some other Southern murderer. And Malcolm X so brilliantly, he said something about the only difference with this person is that when he lynches you, he does it with this kind of accent. And then when Texas, they lynch you with a Texas accent. They know damn difference. So the colonized liberal African petty bourgeoisie also needed democratic changes for its own protection from this arbitrary extrajudicial treatment. Even petty bourgeois educated and otherwise assimilated Africans were subjected to the vicious whims of uncultured, uneducated, reactionary whites who function as extensions of the white colonial state in their treatment of Africans. Additionally, the selfish interests of the African petty bourgeoisie required mass access to the electoral process as a means of acquiring an ability to integrate into the capitalist economic system, which is the definition of equality for the African petty bourgeoisie. To be able to integrate into the capitalist economic system makes them equal. And so this is what they have fought for. And have I gone over the time that was allocated to me? Yeah, okay. 19 minutes. So they needed the African masses to have the ability to vote. That's the African petty bourgeoisie. They needed the African masses to have the ability to vote so they, the African petty bourgeoisie, could be elected to office and positions of power to integrate into the capitalist system as co-predators. These petty bourgeois forces became the burgeoning neo-colonialists. Many had no neo-colonialist aspirations. Often they merely wanted to be part of the existing setup. Some, suffering severe self-alienation, just wanted to be with white people. The revolution from above that we have come to know as the civil rights movement was funded by the liberal white colonial rulers. This explains why the movement had to be based on philosophical nonviolence. The white rulers were not about to fund a movement that would engage in armed resistance to white terror that might destroy our colonial domination. As we analyzed in the book Israel to Africa, the political report to our third Congress back in 1990, quote, the alliance between the liberal oppressor and the liberal oppressed was an alliance between which required a limited or partial revolution. This partial revolution would result in the oppressed African working masses being able to sell their exploited labor to the liberal bourgeoisie and would give access to electorally gained white power to the African primitive petty bourgeoisie. As long as the natural aspirations of the oppressed domestically colonized African people for national liberation, along with the national aspirations of the oppressed domestically colonized African people for national liberation, this was the real political and economic basis of the civil rights movement that mobilized and gave consciousness to millions of Africans throughout the US and the world. This was the real political and economic basis for the heroic existence of the wretched, toiling African masses of the South. But the white liberal oppressors and the oppressed liberal African petty bourgeoisie were determined to obscure the actual material basis of the struggle known as the civil rights movement and the real stakes that were involved. Both were determined to keep the masses of African people convinced that we were struggling to change the feelings of white people toward Africans, or that we were fighting for the right to live with the white oppressor nation, US North American population. Thus, a purely idealistic ideological cover was given to our struggle by the liberal African primitive petty bourgeoisie. We were told that we must be committed to philosophical nonviolence because we were involved in a limited revolution designed to serve the interests of the liberal sector of our colonial oppressor, who would never support a genuine revolution for our oppressed people. Indeed, we were told that such a philosophical commitment to nonviolence was morally cleansing and empowering. However, there was always an undercurrent of resistance to the philosophical idealism, tactics, strategies, and political objectives of the liberal African petty bourgeoisie from the broad perimeter of the Black liberation movement. Much of this resistance came from the masses of oppressed African working people who sometimes participated in the movement despite these differences. So unquote. And so the problem for the white rulers and their compliant African minions was the fact that the fodder for this movement, the impoverished and brutalized Africans of the Southern US, would discover our own interest in the struggle for democracy being sought by the liberal colonizers and colonized alike. Yeah. In the struggle to change the world, these African toilers will ourselves be changed. That happens. We summed up the article, in the article Advanced Detachment, written for the Browning Spirit in 1985, and which appeared in the book of Omali Yeshitela Speaks, quote, during the 1950s, the alliance between our movement and the liberal bourgeoisie consolidated itself in mass struggle. In the process, our movement began to achieve a revolutionary character. This movement activated the African victims of US colonialism as conscious participants and impacted on the consciousness and practical life of all the people inside the United States. This powerful movement overthrew the immediate form of capitalist rule of the Southern white ruling class and achieved legal democratic rights for African people. the thing is that, and it's always the case, when the African liberation movement becomes generalized inside this country and more broadly, it impacts on the consciousness of everybody. And when it becomes generalized, and it's the thing that gave birth to the white women's movement, to the white homosexual movement. As we say, that it was our struggle that took white women out of the kitchens and white homosexuals out of the closet. But colonialism still existed. So, the rights that white women would achieve, these were rights on the backs of colonial people. So white women now want to be equal with male colonizers. It's not a movement to overturn colonialism. If you go back and even look at some of the earlier proponents of that they characterized as feminists, they made that distinction pretty clear. That what they were about was not the liberation of Black people. So that's why you can hear sometimes from the white women's movement, what they characterize as gay movement, is that that this is how they used to treat Black people. This is how they used to treat Black people. This is what you hear. Because there's an assumption that the women and gays have achieved certain rights and achieving in the struggle for certain kinds of rights, and Blacks were, they would say we're fighting for the same thing, but we're not. We want to be free from all colonizers, women colonizers, homosexual colonizers, right-wing colonizers, left-wing colonizers, colonizers who are not clear if it's a he, they, or etc. We want to be free from all colonizers. And that's the struggle that we're involved in. And that's what we cannot allow to be. So the rise of the conscious African working class. The need for change was aptly summed up by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in its slogan, Demand for Black Power, coming in 1966, after the petty bourgeois-led civil rights movement had realized its aims with the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I mentioned, we talk about Civil Rights Bill 64, Voting Rights 65, Voting Rights Act of 1965. Why were they necessary? We're talking about what? Historic moments and et cetera. Why did you have to have a Civil Rights Bill and a Voting Rights Act? Because Black people were not considered in the U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution didn't consider, it had nothing to do with us. Had nothing to do with us. And therefore, for them to be putting me on trial, violating what's supposed to be my free speech rights, that stupid white people don't understand, your free speech rights, your First Amendment rights, because I never had any. If I had them, they wouldn't have had to create in 1965 a right for to have civil rights, or 1964, 1965. These rights are supposed to be. If the Bill of Rights, freed everybody, then why did it have to have these special rights for Black people? Because it didn't free everybody, and that's something for us to be conscious of. So the outcome of the alliance was something that neither the liberal bourgeoisie nor the Black petty bourgeoisie could predict, namely the emergence of an African proletariat rising up from the bowels of America itself, as we observed in Advanced Detachment. While the selfish interests of the African working class proved to be in contradiction with the aims of colonial white power, they were in contradiction with the interests and aims of the Black petty bourgeoisie as well. We noted again in Advanced Detachment, quote, an inconsistent, though generally materialist philosophy of Black nationalism began to emerge out of the aims of the African working class, out of the aims of the African working class. Black nationalism began to reject the idealist and obscurantist philosophy of the liberal Black petty bourgeoisie. Martin Luther King's dream of a better day in America as a consequence of the moral regeneration of whites of the oppressor nation was challenged by the nightmare as defined by Malcolm X. The African proletariat, facing objective reality in America, raised the demand for Black power to determine our own Black reality. Indeed, the Black Power slogan demand captured the reality of the entire African nation within the U.S. and the world. Inside the U.S. during this period, every African community was literally on fire with rebellion and anti-colonial resistance. It was an anti-colonial demand that challenged the limitations of the call for equality and rights within the colonial relationship. I cannot remember the number, but there were thousands, literally thousands of uprisings of African people in this country within a particular short period in the 1960s, literally thousands, so maybe 60,000 rebellions happening throughout this country by Black people who were not saying we shall overcome, and who were not saying hands up, don't shoot, and who were not saying Black Lives Matter, but they were engaged in real rebellions to overturn this thing. That was in the 1960s. That was highlight, and that was something that terrorized the U.S. Ruling class and fractured this whole notion of a compliant, complacent African petty bourgeoisie, African population. So the Black Power demand gave a taste of political power to the masses of African people everywhere. As we continued in the paper, Advanced Detachment, quote, for the new generation of fully mobilized African workers that was thrust onto the scene as the main social factor in U.S. political life. Let's say that again. The new generation of fully mobilized African workers that was thrust onto the scene as the main social factor in U.S. political life, its aspirations were far from being met by gaining legal democratic rights. The attempts, and this is a real contradiction, because the struggle of African people, once it gets generalized as a struggle for power, as a struggle for national liberation, it is the main social factor in this country. That's why they have to do so much. That's why the guy who headed the American secret political police, called the FBI, declared that the Black Panther Party was the greatest threat to the internal security of this country since the Civil War. That's why they come down on us the way they come down on us. And this is something we have to reveal. Because they would come at us, they would come in armored vehicles like they did with us on July 29, 2022. They would come at us because once what we represent is generalized among the masses of African people, they got a full-scale problem, not just here, but around the world. Just like African people in Africa look at Will Smith and look at all these other Negroes as some kind of examples, they also looked at Malcolm X and Fred Hampton and the Black Revolution that was happening here in the country. This is it. This is it. So the attempts by the Black petty bourgeoisie to moderate the Black liberation movement, to decelerate it and direct it toward liberal bourgeois democratic SUPs were met with cries of burn, baby, burn in Los Angeles and Black Power in Mississippi. At this point, the independent aspiration of the African working class became clear. This new clarity fueled efforts to build independent political parties by and for the colonial oppressed African population. We explained further in the 1998 presentation that we called The Wolf and the Double-Edged Blade published in Amalia Shatella Speaks. Quote, our movement emerged as an anti-colonial movement at the moment when the issue became one of power. When African workers had Black power, they united with struggles like the ones being led by Che Guevara throughout Latin America and Africa. By 1967, we saw the rise of the Black Panther Party, which took the struggle even further. The Black Panther Party was immediately and explicitly informed and influenced by Malcolm X, who told us that since it's legal to have a shotgun, every African should have one in his or her house. With the emergence of the Black Panther Party, we saw tremendous anxiety in this country, so much so that J. Edgar Hoover, who was then the executive director of the FBI, which is one of the secret political police agencies in this country, characterized the Black Panther Party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States since the Civil War. Not Gaddafi, not Saddam Hussein, not the Russians, but ordinary African working class folk, most of whom lived in housing projects and had to use public transportation to get from one part of the city to the other. That's a statement about where power can be found in the masses of African workers and poor people who, given organization and ideological clarity, can achieve anything. That's the thing that Hoover and the FBI recognized. Unfortunately, not too many of our leaders today recognize that. We know that the Black Revolution, once unleashed, gave rise to virtually every other progressive entity that sprung up in this country. It was the Black Revolution that took white women out of the kitchen and homosexuals out of the closet. It was the Black Revolution that energized the movements of other oppressed peoples, including indigenous people in this country. It was a powerful and profound movement that shook this country to its very foundation. This is why the government put in place a program to cut down and undermine the Black Revolution, assassinate our leaders. They created what we refer to as counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency uses every form of attack: psychological warfare, actual armed struggle, economic warfare. The name of the government's counterinsurgency against the Black Revolution was COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. COINTELPRO was the program used to assassinate and imprison our leaders and destroy our organizations. And I just want to say this was one of the programs. And we've come to learn that it was much more insidious than just this FBI thing. And in fact, I'm convinced that the US government will allow us to know about COINTELPRO and talk about it a lot, because it obscures the reality that there's so many counterinsurgency programs that utilize against Black people every damn day of our lives. They'd be crazy not to have a contingency plan to deal with Black people in this country. They'd be out of their minds if they didn't have it. You can't have a colonized population as such and then not have a plan to deal with them, because you know ultimately they're going to rise up. That has to happen. So how am I doing in terms of time? Have I used up my 19 minutes yet?
Chairman, I think this might be a good place to stop because we only have 2 minutes left.
Okay, all right. So that sounds good to me. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
All right, Comrade Uhuru. So this is page 81. Page 81. Okay, Uhuru.
Uhuru, and I mean, wow, it's like we're just getting started in a certain way. We have so much more to cover in this chapter, but this has just been really profound. And I just going back a couple of paragraphs where it reads, not Gaddafi, not Saddam Hussein, not the Russians, but ordinary African working class folk. And, just how that speaks to, like you said, why they're making this war against the party right now. And that it's not any of the things that they're saying this is about. It's because of the threat that the African People's Socialist Party, represents to the stability, of this whole social system built on the oppression and exploitation of African people. That's what they're contending with, and they can't say that. So just really want to salute, your leadership in this chapter. And, you opened up, and just want to unite that it's true. There is no better scientific assessment of the defeat of the Black Revolution of the 1960s and the conditions that led up to it, and just how African internationalism truly does explain the world and helps us understand how all of these things that we sometimes assume have always been here or has always been this way, how it actually came into existence. And that just informs us that it's possible to tear it down, burn, baby, burn, that it's possible. So just, again, really salute your leadership. Excited to continue studying this chapter. Comrades, if you have questions for today's study, go ahead and put them into the chat right now so that we can take them when we get to that portion of the program. We're almost there. We're just going to get through our announcements, and then we'll open it up.
May I just want to say this before that. You mentioned burn, baby, burn. And most people, many people may not even know about that slogan. It made itself manifest in 1965 during the Watts Rebellion. And the origin of the slogan was not the civil rights movement. In fact, there's stories that can be told about that as well. The origin of the slogan was a disc jockey in Los Angeles who, when playing music that was like, was going burn, baby, burn, like this. It was, that was just how we were, appreciating a song, appreciating music, appreciating a sound, just burning, burn, baby, burn, and like it's lit, you know what I'm saying? And that was how it was being said at the time. And I just think about this and how this is how we were talking about music, and then how that got transferred over to the struggle that Black people were involved in. It was so fitting, burn, baby, burn. That's what's happening throughout Watts at the time. And that's what's happening in various places around the country. So you will hear Africans going, burn, baby, burn. That that became like an incredible slogan. It was definitely different from Black Lives Matter, you know. I just wanted to. I think that's really significant as well. Yeah.
Yes. I knew Burn Baby Burn from a song, you know, like I know the tune. And the roof is on fire. And
Yeah.
I think maybe a fitting origin is Coupe Tete Boule Kai, maybe.
Bulekai. Kubertet Bulekai. That was from the Haitian Revolution. It meant cut off heads and burn houses.
Yeah.
You know, uhuru. All right, go ahead. Come on. Uhuru.
Yes, so let's go ahead and get into these announcements so we can get into some discussion, comrades. And we'll kick it off first with a call to join the counteroffensive to stop the FBI attacks on the African People's Socialist Party and the African liberation struggle. Drop the charges against the Uhuru 3, sign the petition, the emergency response pledge for immediate text messages regarding the trial, read all of the court documents, complete the Uhuru 3 trial commitment and volunteer form. You can do all of this and more by going to handsoffuhuru.org. And all out for the Uhuru 3 trial, which is set for September 3rd in Tampa, Florida. We are 86 days away from the trial, and we're calling on all to sign up to attend the trial or volunteer. Sign up at handsoffahuru.org/trial to let us know you will be there, and expect more information very soon about how we will wage this fight back on the ground. Make this demand to drop the charges on the Uhuru 3 and prepare to put the colonial state on trial. Again, go to handsoffahuru.org/trial to complete the commitment form. The African National Women's Organization is excited to announce a transformative project, the rehabilitation of 4617 Natural Bridge Avenue in St. Louis, Missouri. This property will become the African National Women's Organization Liberation Center, serving as the headquarters for ANWO and a dedicated space for organizing against the special oppression of African women. We need your support to make this vision a reality. Visit bit.ly/ANWO, that's ANWO Center 1, to contribute to their fundraising effort and spread the word. The Black Power Blueprint Live presents African Women Must Lead, One Africa, One Nation Farmers Market, an economic self-reliance program of the African National Women's Organization. This live program features ANWO President and One Africa, One Nation Market Coordinator Yejide Odumila, with the new One Africa, One Nation Market Leadership Team, as well as friends from our community of vendors and cultural performers. Join us live at the Uhuru House in St. Louis and on Zoom. This program will be hosted by the African People's Education and Defense Fund President, Onizine Ishitela. RSVP at tinyurl.com/African Women Must Lead. And on Wednesday, June 12th at 6:30 p.m. Pacific time, the Uhuru Solidarity Movement hosts a public forum titled Defend Anti-Colonial Free Speech, Stop FBI Attacks, Drop the Charges Against the Uhuru 3. This takes place in person at the First United Methodist Church in Tacoma, Washington, and online. The program features Hands Off Uhuru Chair Mwezi Odom, APS, the African People's Solidarity Committee Chairwoman Penny Hess, and Uhuru Solidarity Movement Chair Jesse Neville, as well as representatives of organizations supporting the campaign to drop the charges. Register at tinyurl.com/Uhuru3 Tacoma. On Friday, June 14th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, join the African National Women's Organization program African Women Must Lead and host Jay Amechi as she unpacks the historical context and enduring impact of colonial gender constructs on African people. She will delve into the ways these constructs have been used to control and oppress, and explore the resistance of communities reclaiming their authentic gender identities and traditions. Get the registration link at theburningspear.com/events. On Saturday, June 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central, and 12 p.m. Pacific, the Hands Off Uhuru Fight Back Coalition presents Report Back from the Front Lines, Cuba and Gaza, Build the Anti-Colonial Free Speech Movement. You can register at handsoffahuru.org/reportback. And the Black Power Blueprint is launching the Black Power Vanguard Girls Summer Basketball Program. We are recruiting coaches and girls to participate. If you are in St. Louis, please spread the word, especially to get our young participants. Our goal is to have 20 girls between the ages of 11 and 14 participate in this program this summer. Call 314-380-8016 or email info@blackpowerblueprint.org. On Wednesday, June 26th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 6:30 p.m. Central, the African People's Solidarity Committee hosts an event calling on white people to join the struggle to defend anti-colonial free speech. Learn about the historic campaigns of the African People's Socialist Party to push back attacks by the colonial state on African people and the party itself. Learn how you can get involved in today's struggle to drop the bogus charges against the Uhuru Three with special guest speaker, Chairman Amalia Shatella. This event will be held in person at Aquaba Hall in St. Petersburg, Florida, located at 1245 Tyrone Lewis Avenue or 18th Avenue South, St. Petersburg, Florida, and online. Register at apscuhuru.org/register. And make sure you like and subscribe to the Burning Spirit TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru Tours and Speakers Bureau is an institution of the African People's Socialist Party that coordinates events and tours for Chairman Amalia Shatella and other party speakers and leaders. Book Chairman Amalia and other Uhuru Movement speakers for your campus or organization now. Email info@uhurutours.com or call 727-914-3621. And for more events not announced here, go to theburningspear.com/events calendar to see everything we've got going on inside the Uhuru movement. All right, comrades, so that concludes our announcements for today. We're going to go ahead and get to your questions from our live audience. And I want to shout out where people are watching from. We have St. Louis, Missouri in the house, San Diego, California, Buena Park, California, Houston, Texas, Battle Creek, Michigan, Largo, Florida, Occupied Azania or South Africa, St. Petersburg, Florida, Fort Myers, Florida, New Orleans, Louisiana, Tatums, Oklahoma, Grenada, West Indies, Doha, Qatar, Hollywood, Florida, Jamaica, Queens, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Spokane, Washington, Chicago, Illinois, Denmark, Sierra Leone, West Africa, Fresno, California, Flossmoor, Illinois, and Virginia in the house, Chesapeake, Virginia, Hampton, Virginia, Yorktown, Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia, Lakeland, Florida, and Clearwater, Florida, all joined with us today. Thank you, comrades, for joining everywhere you're located and participating in the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. So this first question, Chairman, came from Comrade Arthur in Fresno, California, and asks, did the need to rebuild Europe after the Second Imperialist War cause the outsourcing of African jobs, leading to welfare programs that undermined the African family, creating the conditions that made the war on drugs effective and forcing Africans into prison to create a free workforce?
I'm not quite sure I understand Arthur's question. I knew that Arthur would have to be, it was in the queue. I was going to be raising a question, but I'm not quite sure I understand it. Does the need for Africa to rebuild Europe result in the outsourcing of African jobs? Where? Yeah. African jobs where? Mm-hmm. It was the importation of jobs for Africans in Europe. And what it did was suck Africans away from the islands and suck other people away from India, et cetera. That was also controlled by England at the time. And it was the deployment by the colonizer of African labor exactly where the colonizers would have us deployed to its benefit. In this instance, what they characterized as the mother country was the location. But I think that what this helps to do is to remind us that the struggle we are involved in is a struggle, as I mentioned earlier, to liberate the forces of production. As I say, African people do not have control of forces of production. Forces of production are actually necessary for the process of producing things. And the forces, as they creating life, creating wealth, creating resources, et cetera. And the forces of production include several things, but the critical things that is included in the forces of production is land, the land on which production occurs. There has to be land on which it doesn't happen in cyberspace. Despite the fact that you get a lot of likes and stuff like that, real production happens on land. That's where food and factories and all of this other stuff, like exists. And then another critical component of the forces of production is human labor and the people who know how to use that labor on the land to producing. When I say on the land, I'm not just talking about as farmers, but I'm talking about generally speaking. So when we what has happened is that the colonial mode of production has resulted in the appropriation of the forces of production. It controls it, whether that's in Africa or whether that's in England. The forces of production in England, that social system, that government is in charge of deploying those forces of production. But if you're a colonial power, you can deploy forces of production in an international arena with a global mode of colonial mode of production. So in terms of how it results in outsourcing jobs for Black people, if you mean, did Black people in England lose jobs as a consequence of colonized people being brought to England to rebuild England? Well, there might have been some Black people who lost jobs, but the fact is Black people never had any jobs, because the whole question is to liberate the forces of production, which is the land and the people, which means, the jobs that they would be involved in. So, Arthur, I know that was a long response to what you raised, but you always raise interesting and relatively complex questions. So I hope we touched on it anyway. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, thank you. And thank you, Comrade Arthur. And Comrade Arthur did comment, I get with, trying to clarify, was saying jobs like shipbuilding, the jobs in California like shipbuilding. So that was a comment that he made while you were, answering his question.
Well, let me just say this about shipbuilding, and this is probably not exactly related to what Arthur just raised. But I know that African people were brought in to Oakland, California, in particular, during the Second Imperialist World War, and to work in that industry. And I think Africans built something like a ship a day for Kaiser. Built a ship a day. So if that's the kind of stuff you're talking about, that definitely did occur. And Africans built a ship a day for Kaiser during the Second Imperialist World War, and denied African people to have Black Star Lines with a few ships, that during the, with Marcus Garvey and what have you. But we built a ship a day, and that's, again, it should make the point that I'm talking about in terms of liberating the productive forces. So the productive forces are commanded by the society, the community, to which they should be deployed. We have colonialism, the colonizer controls all the productive forces. If you have a colonial mode of production, the colonizer controls the productive forces where he is located, whether that's in Oakland, California, whether that's in Liverpool, in England, or whether that is in various other countries. They brought Africans from to Oakland, from Mississippi and Louisiana and what have you, to work in those damn factories. And they brought along with them, they brought big white guys from Mississippi, Alabama, to function as police to control that African labor force. So the whole issue, and that's the reputation. That's why the Black Panther Party, one of the things that really informed the rise of the Black Panther Party, I mean, in general, it was informed by just condition of colonialism. But in Oakland, there was an actual program of recruiting crackers from down south, who have a history and tradition of extreme brutality against African people for the police force that was there. Uhuru. So I'm trying to work with it, Arthur.
Uhuru, Chairman. Thank you. And again, thank you, Comrade Arthur, for your question. Also want to shout out Geismar, Louisiana, Brooklyn, New York, and Alaska. Also let us know that they're checking in today. This is a comment that came from Sean Conscious Image. And this was, just with regard to the section in this chapter where, it talks about the class struggle that emerged in Europe, or just the whole question of the class struggle, as you were, summing it up, but says, I trust the outwardly white sheet wearing Ku Klux Klan Nazi racist over the bleeding heart white supremacist liberal. at least the Ku Klux Klan and the racists that call you the N-word are being honest with you and isn't his intentions and thoughts about you contrary to the liberal white supremacists. Same bird, different wings is what Sean said. And then Chairman, I don't know if you know James Ivory, but they reference you. They said that you were there. Anyway, it seems like they are familiar with you and says, and I know you've mentioned this comrade before, but Ping said, Ping is a comrade who learned me to yell, burn, baby, burn. So.
Ping was our Minister of Defense for Jomo. So many years ago, he was a heroic brother. And I remember during one of the rebellions in St. Petersburg, Florida, this was a rebellion that was sparked by the fact that the police had handcuffed me in the backseat of a police cruiser and had beaten me with clubs and what have you. They did a job, and the rebellion kicked off, and people were looking for Ping and Jomo, and they finally found him, and he was sitting on the counter in one of these, something like a 7-Eleven. That may have predated the 7-Elevens, I don't remember. But something like that, and with his leg crossed, and the place was burning down, and Ping was sitting there on the counter, his legs sipping on a Slurpee. That was Ping, who James Iverson just referenced. He was a great soldier, unsung hero. He was, when the police beat me, as I mentioned, and I was taken to the hospital, and when I was in the emergency room on this gurney, and first person to come in was the Jomo treasurer at the time, who, by the way, was a dentist. And he came in and just wanted to check me out and see how they had messed up my teeth and that kind of thing. And then Ping walked in. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, and he turned on his heel and walked out. Anyway, he knocked out everything white between the emergency room to the exit. He was a hero, and he was a small guy, but he was serious, you know. Anyway, James Ivory, I'm glad to see you there. Uhuru, thank you.
Uhuru,
Did he say he was related to Ping?
No, James was actually, looks like he was a member of Jomo.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right on.
Yes, right on, comrade. And I want to take this next question. We have some other comments that I'll get back to. Oh, I did want to acknowledge this, a reminder from Comrade Sayero in Battle Creek, Michigan, that Comrade Leonard Peltier goes before the Colonial Imperialist Parole Board on tomorrow, June 10th. And we are involved in that struggle, united with the struggle, not one more year, free Leonard Peltier. So just wanted to raise that as well. Thank you, Comrade Sayero. Tag 5104 ask, Chairman, is there a dime bit of difference between the two-party system in the US as opposed to a system of central command in China? Aren't both systems limited by the forces who lead? That was tag 5104.
Can you hold that for me, 5104?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you come back to that? I'm trying to remember, there was a question, a comment somebody made just before that. Perhaps it was Sean Conscious Image. Yes. Can you say what that comment was, or the whole thing?
Yes, it was essentially
liberal, like prefer, I've heard Africans say that, and, and because it can be problematic, because you get somebody like a Trump, who says things that are really odious and to your face and in your face, et cetera. And then you get somebody like a Biden who loves you when he's not sending police to your communities and signing bills that oppose to even civil rights and things like that. And so somebody said, I'd rather have a Trump because at least he's, right up front. But I think one of the things that we really have to grapple with in a very serious way, Sean Conscious Image, is that the colonizer, we're in a struggle against colonialism. And sometimes the colonizers will be nice people. They'll even sleep with you, have sex, and do other kinds of things like that, but they're opposed to your liberation from colonialism. Sometimes the colonizers are not nice people, but they are still colonizers. Everything they have rests upon the foundation of you being colonized. So that's true of nice colonizers and unnice colonizers. So I just think that we have to be careful not to be, drugged, put to sleep by the fact that there's a nice colonizer, as that's what you're suggesting, and to know that there is no fundamental distinction between colonizers. So what has to happen is what draws the line is the opposition to the colonial domination of African people. That's the thing that draws the line. And that what happens is that what we see, we live in a world that the colonizers have disagreements among themselves. And at some times, the disagreements among themselves are things that we can use as long as we understand that our objective is to get free of colonialism. Sometimes the disagreements among the colonizers can be used to facilitate our trajectory toward the end of colonialism. And we can move in this direction based on this stance by a colonizer, this direction based on that stance by a colonizer, but we're not married to either of them. What we are wedded to is freedom. And we know that the freedom means overturning colonialism. And we know that there's a distinction between African people, even sellout Negro, bootlicking, butt-kissing, vomit-eating sellouts, Negroes. There's a distinction between the African colonized people and the colonizer. So the point is, what position ultimately do they take around colonialism? Not whether they like you or not. I mean, I really believe that it's possible to go to a Ku Klux Klan rally and see Klansperson wearing Michael Jordan T-shirts. They love Michael Jordan. I believe that. I believe that there are Klans people who love Whoopi Goldberg and other kinds of African people who entertain them. That's what we're supposed to do, entertain, play ball, jump high, throw, et cetera, et cetera. And that's harmless. That's beneficial. That suits all of their needs. Their children enjoy watching it. Come on, watch the Negro jump, kind of thing. I mean, I think that happens, and et cetera. So, Sean Conscious Image, I understand what you were saying, and I would prefer to know this person also, the individual. But I think it's really important for us to also recognize that it's not the individual like that. The question is whether we're looking at forces who are opposed to colonialism, because nice white people and unnice white people are colonizers. Even in our movement, the solidarity forces recognize that they are colonizers, just objectively speaking, in terms of the place, their location in this relationship in the colonial mode of production. But they fight against colonialism. They fight against colonialism behind enemy lines. And part of the fight against colonialism is neutralizing every force of the colonizer that can be neutralized, and also winning other colonizers to come on the side of the colonized, to overturn the system of colonialism, the mode of production that is basis for every exploitation, every oppression that we experience, both as white people and as Africans, et cetera. Anyway, Sean, thank you so much.
Yes, Chairman. Anti-colonial colonizers. That's
yes. Anti-colonial colonizers.
Yes, Uhuru, Chairman. And we have just about 5 minutes left, Chairman. That the last question we took. Well, there's another question we'll have to possibly save for a future study. But there was the question from tab 5104, who asked about the difference between the two-party system in the U.S. as opposed to that of China, the Central Command in China. And the question was, aren't both systems limited by the forces who lead? So that might wrap us up for today.
I don't know about the limitations of the systems being basically or primarily attached to the persons who lead. I think that it's possible if as a party exists, if we live in a society that still has class contradictions, you're going to have something that our political parties, whether they call that or not, if class contradictions exist in society, these political parties, in some circumstances, such as what you find in America, most of Europe, a means by which the bourgeoisie, so you can call it Republican, you can call it Democrats, the bourgeoisie, they support the same colonialism, but they have a different immediate kind of interest that they want to achieve under colonial capitalists, and they have their policies will look different, and they will try to win people who live in these societies to this colonial policy versus that colonial policy. And some of them will do it through kissing babies, or all of them have to kiss the babies, that kind of thing. But the point is that that's the difference. It's not something that is designed to overturn the system. Now, in China, I think that you have a system that's based on certain assumptions. Initially, it was based on assumptions that was reached, I think, the highest level of significance for the struggle of the people of the world under Mao Zedong, who was part of a movement which at the time, the communist movement at the time, even when it was split, so that there were sectors who were more attached to Russia, Soviet Union than to China. The objective was to create a world of the oppressed working class would come to power. And they saw that as a global process, with China, of course, having a distinct difference in terms of the pursuit of that in being through the peasantry, who represent the majority of the peoples of the world, and the Soviet Union, what has been a classical Marxist stance around, and China also considered itself a Marxist, as say under Mao, Marxism, with a Chinese identity, more or less. So the China that we see today, and there are things available that you can read by Xi Jinping, who is a leader there, with political reports and programs that's been made to the Chinese government that says something about where it is they're trying to go. They still characterize themselves as the Chinese Communist Party. But now what we see is the highest expressions of its interest, of its intent, is not to in a contest with world capitalism versus world communism. It's a contest, it appears, that China is waging to minimize the authority and control of the United States. And, they talk a little, just as Russia does, by multipolar world, and things like that, and they fight against the hegemony of the United States, but we hear very little, or I do anyway, and perhaps I'm not as much in tune with this as Tog is. But so that's how I perceive it. I mean, we have a responsibility as African internationalists, while we can unite with a struggle against the unipolar world. In so doing, the only thing you're doing is uniting that the United States shouldn't dominate the world. That's when they say unipolar, they mean the world that's dominated by the United States. So we can unite with the objective of creating a world that's not dominated by the United States. So if you got you got forces who are doing that, that's right on. But we have to have our own objectives as African internationalists, and we want to create a different world. So there are not a lot of poles in this world where the colonized and the working class, the colonized, where the central working class issue is concentrated, would become the new ruling class. The working class becomes a new ruling class. And so that's on a global level. And the problem is that Marxism, as it's been understood and applied, has not provided direction beyond what we saw happen with the Soviet Union and China and perhaps Cuba, Vietnam, and they didn't go where Marx presumed that they should go, because based on much of Marxism, there should be the end of oppression, end of exploitation, coming in Cuba, coming in the Soviet Union after that revolution. It didn't happen. Coming in China, it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because the root contradiction was then and continues to be the colonial mode of production. Colonialism as the mode of production that Marx mischaracterized as a primitive accumulation of capital. That colonialism still exists, but we can destroy it. That's why we move to unite the colonial peoples of the world on a common trajectory. That's why we say the colonial mode of production does not see the Palestinians stand alone and separate from the struggle of Africans and the struggle of people in Cuba and various other places around the world. It's the same colonialism. We don't have a lot of colonialism. We have one colonial mode of production, and all of us can participate in that. And we can give a new kind of life and a dynamic life to the slogan by Che Guevara when he was speaking about the war that the U.S. was engaged in Vietnam and calling for 2, 3 mini Vietnams. And that's what has to happen because there's no colonial power that can fight us all together. And that's what has to happen. Bring the whole colonial world into this project of overturning colonial mode of production. That's what we are involved in here in St. Louis, here in what they call South Africa and various other places around the world. So that was a long response to talk, but and probably partially based on not being as clear as I need to be on what is understood that what Todd was putting forth. But that's my response to it. Thank you, Comrade Todd.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Comrade Tog. And you know, Tog, it might be Tag or Tog, but says Uhuru, Chairman. And yeah, it seems like, you know, they're in unity with the position you put forward. So just appreciate all of the questions that have come in, and comrades, I know that there are other questions. We do have to wrap up the study, unfortunately, for today, but not to fret, because we will continue on with the study of this chapter 3 and also the questions that came in that we weren't able to get to. We'll save that for the Q&A portion for our next study. So, and I also want to shout out Sacramento, California, and Ghana, West Africa, that checked in with us as well this morning. Uhuru, comrades, glad to have you on with us all over the world. People are tuned in to Omali Taught Me Sunday Study to get this political education. Continue to share, continue to invite, you know, friends, family, comrades to this process as we do this. And I just want to now see, Chairman, if there are any closing remarks before we officially wrap up the study for today.
Only thing I have to say is that all out for September 3rd, Tampa Bay, Tampa, Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida, and that there's going to be a long, hot summer, and that's beginning now. And the long, hot summer is in preparation for the trial that we're going to be having, and everybody should get there, sign up, register for it, because we expect every legitimate progressive revolutionary force in this country and some from outside of this country to be in Tampa, where we're going to put the state on trial. So thank you, everybody, all of you comrades, for being here, and I'll see you next week for this study. Thank you, Comrade Director Akile. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Well, I want to salute this incredible discussion that we've been able to have. And I want to thank the Omali Taught Me show team. I also want to thank all of you for tuning in to today's study. Whether you are watching with us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, or Twitter, we are glad to have you on with us. And of course, have to salute the brilliant leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Make sure to follow the chairman on Facebook, Twitter, or formerly Twitter X, TikTok, Twitch, and Instagram, and subscribe to the Burning Spirit TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. And get to Tampa, Florida for the kickoff of the September 3rd trial. And get in, you know, in advance because there's going to be very important actions and, you know, rallies, marches, and things happening, you know, in Florida. So go ahead and go to handsoffofruit.org/trial, fill out that form. make your commitment and bring other people with you to Tampa, Florida, to get ready for this really important, the most important trial certainly of the century and in this country, and even in the world, just in terms of the implications that it has. So again, comrades, that's handsoffuhuru.org/trial, and we will catch you on the next episode of the O'Malley Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru, Vanguard up, relentless.
Relentless.
Uhuru.